Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for the third in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute Friday morning series. TGI FHI gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences faculty at Duke University. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. While I regret that we cannot host you this morning over breakfast in Smith Warehouse at Duke University, our usual TGI FHI location, I'm really delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs, and also you can find an interview with today's speaker, Phil Rupprecht, in which he describes his interest, the trajectory of his career, and his current scholarship. This morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Phil, who is Professor of Music at Duke University. He is the author of two monographs, Britain's Musical Language from Cambridge University Press in 2001, and British Musical Modernism, the Manchester Group and Their Contemporaries, also from Cambridge, from 2015. In addition, he is the editor of Rethinking Britain from OUP, and the co-editor of two other volumes. At Duke, he has served as the chair of the music department from 2015 to 2019, and has been a longtime friend of FHI, has served on our board and organized in 2017 also an international symposium on British music and Europe in the age of Brexit. Phil's work is broadly in the area of musicology, and within that, he works in both historical and contextual analysis and the analytical technical study of music. He underscores in his work the necessity of these aspects of the work thought together in order to have a thorough understanding of either. His first book explored Benjamin Britten's operas, considering the span of Britten's career from Peter Grimes in the 40s to Death in Venice in the 70s. And he centered there on the changes in tonality of the works over this span, also on Britain's strategic use of tonality to achieve distinct musical dramatic effect. In doing this, he analyzed the way in which music and words function together, looking to the idea of utterance and drawing on a range of thinkers from J.L. Austin, Ferdinand de Saussure, Roman Jakobson, and Michael Bakhtin. In doing so, he writes, he does not wish to, quote, overturn the argument regarding the differing role of words and music outright by denying the role of verbal signification or by ignoring music's potential for emotional significance, but instead to reframe the discussion in terms that do not isolate questions of semantic reference from the other factors that make up the speech event. His second book similarly weaves together technical musical analyses with historical contextualization to present the ways in which British modernist music was made. And he, in that book, quote, explores the music history bound up with the formation and transmission of a new British music, considered as a coherent expression of the nation at a time of fragile cultural renewal in Europe, telling us that, quote, the story of British musical modernism is invariably situated on the border of two competing myths, one cosmopolitan internationalist in essence, the other homogeneous national. He shows how members of the Manchester Group, Peter Maxwell Davies, Alexander Gough, and Harrison Birtwistle, were thought of in contrast to a kind of British musical pastoralism, taking on, as they did, an internationalist aesthetic. But, Phil argues, important crucibles for the development and performance of avant-garde music in Britain, from music schools to the influence of particular art exhibitions, in addition to circulation and promotion, created Britain's musical world that was shaped as much by ideas of public taste and institutional power of reviewers in newspapers, of the BBC, and in other prestigious outlets, as the music was itself. In a recent award-winning article, Rhythmic Dignity, Motive, Signal, and Flux in the Music of James Dillon, Phil goes into great detail to consider the ways in which Dillon's musical, musical complexity needs to be understood, particularly through his use of rhythm. He understands this through Schoenberg's idea of musical motive, or, quote, memorable shape or contours from which subsequent figures derive by varied repetition. And he highlights the fragile conditions, quote, the fragile conditions of possibility attending traditional motives as graspable patterns in time. Through an analysis of Dillon's composition after Baudelaire, Spleen, he shows how time itself, meanwhile, always flows on in Dillon's work. The continuity and evanescence of its passage is made evident through rhythmic cuts. Today, Phil's talk continues his work on the development of British musical taste, the idea of British musical taste, and is titled Music, Bureaucracy, and the Production of Taste, Malcolm Arnold and the BBC in the 1950s. Thanks very much for joining us. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Ranji, for that very generous talk. Can you hear me? No.
Yes, we can hear you, Phil.
Okay. I was getting a weird message from the machine. Thank you, Ranji, for such a generous introduction and for the invitation to join this series, which I think is keeping us all from going stir crazy here in 2021. Thanks to Sarah and Jennifer for their support on advanced publicity for this event. And thanks to you all for coming. Just so you know, because we're in webinar format, which is new to many of us, there's a few dozen people here. There's people here from Santa Barbara, California, Canada, colleagues and friends from Cardiff and London, and my friends and colleagues in Duke's music department and theatre department and English department, other departments. So it's actually something we couldn't do live in Smith Warehouse. So thank you all for making the time. And although you can't see each other, perhaps you can, rattle your jewelry or something and just feel that we're all here together. So without further ado, music, bureaucracy, and the production of taste, Malcolm Arnold and the BBC in the 1950s. My title has dates, and so it promises you history. Hearing Arnold's mid-20th century music originally, I myself was drawn to a particular tone of voice, candid, bracing, almost fierce. After this emotional response, I wanted to articulate historical contexts. Before doing so, though, let me sketch a brief prelude, for there are methodological challenges to own up to. First, about the history in music history. And second, regarding that most elusive category of cultural reception, taste. And don't worry, we'll get to the bureaucracy soon enough. How to write music's history? Or, as Richard Taruskin bluntly asks in his ambitious 5-volume Oxford History of Western Music, the history of what? Music's history for Taruskin will involve, quote, actions of human agents, real people, not musical works considered as autonomous forms or a procession of styles. The claim need not preclude wider networks of social relations, institutional systems, pedagogies, or patterns of consumption and dissemination involving patrons, publishers, critics, and so on. But as Michael Galope observes, Taruskin's insistence that agents must be real people downplays the complications of historical causality. It was Hume who doubted the efficiency of single causes. Causes, plural, radiate back from the event. And for Bertrand Russell, a multiplicity of determinants, mechanical, volitional, teleological, and so on, inform any event. Oh, I must share my screen, right? Sorry, mistake number one. Sorry about this.
It's fine, Phil. It's fine, Phil. Just take your time. You probably want to go. Yes, slideshow mode. Exactly.
Exactly. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. A snappy definition of the past by R.G. Collingwood, quote, particular events in space and time, which are no longer happening, appeals to me. But where, in the case of a particular space or time, Britain in the years after 1945, will this lead historians? Defining a British context for Arnold's music, which particulars count and which should I select? Is or was British music determined by memories of war, political leaders, a coronation in 1953, the Suez military withdrawal, 1956, or Wolfenden's report recommending decriminalizing homosexuality in 1957? Can a cultural plot be recuperated from a bracing structure of familiar signs? Are period artworks epistemically bound to serious, angry young men or funny Ealing comedies? Are either of them, per Madison Avenue blurbs, logical spokesmen for our confused atomic age? In a strictly visual plastic mode of the mid-century, what corresponds to geopolitical Cold War, to post-Blitz rebuilding, to austerity, prosperity, or angst, post-colonial or existentialist? To which register, expressionist, pastoral, abstract, technological, will music history best appeal in pursuing sustained interpretive readings? Let me introduce for you an eyewitness while tightening the geographic focus to a specifically British cultural field. Here's the critic Richard Hoggart, writing in 1958, attempting to capture the mood. Two motifs are in play: social class and the implied threat of low culture to high art. He imagines a young teacher in a new comprehensive school teaching poetry. Quote, he finds it surprisingly rewarding, at times extremely disillusioning. His pupils go to the pictures at least once a week and watch television for 2 or 3 hours a night. They tell him about the programs in a friendly way. They know he hasn't a TV set. He's an ex-scholarship boy, by choice, committed to educating people whom he knows as deeply as one only knows those one was born among, and who he yet feels he does not know. For Hoggart, it's the link between social class and culture that matters most. He accents a value division between genuine high art, poetry, and mere entertainment, TV, movies. And he's torn between his own working class roots and the social mobility education affords. His modest hope in 1958 is that Britain is moving, quote, towards a cultural classlessness, end quote. Hoggart's decoupling of class and culture was optimistic, and critical tension shifted in the New Left Review and in cultural studies in the 60s towards according greater respect for the vernacular, movies and pop music not excluded. Books like Stuart Hall and Paddy Winnell's the popular arts, 1964, however, as Richard Dyer observes, continued a Leavisite critical judgment forged in sustained attention to form and narrative pattern. For Hoggart's TV-watching 13-year-olds, meanwhile, mid-century culture was, as Raymond Williams said, ordinary. Schooling might lead them to poems by Auden or music by Vaughan Williams, but it competed with new forms of mass media. It's just possible, though, that they had heard music by my protagonist, Malcolm Arnold. By 1958, after all, Arnold had won an Oscar for scoring Bridge on the River Kwai, David Lean, among many Hollywood film soundtracks he did in this period. This composer, as we'll see, was a cultural conundrum for theorists of high and low, popular with audiences, but despised by the critical establishment. Perhaps the finale of his second symphony, Symphony No. 2, which he describes as very light-hearted, will give you a sense of why tastes diverged. That cheeky tune for woodwinds, then strings, nudged by a fairground waltz, and then boldly juxtaposed with the sterner brass figure at the end, is hardly the sound we associate with Cold War musical modernism. We'll get to Arnold in close-up. Before that, I want to survey the post-war British music, the post-war British establishment as an arbiter of cultural value. If historical causality is the issue, my perspective seeks to skirt both discrete biographical agents and metaphysical stylistic forces. To understand 50s music today, we take on bureaucracy. Above all, that most well-spoken of elephants in the room, the BBC. That the national broadcaster was the largest purveyor of low and high culture in 50s Britain, still mostly through the radio, is not news. What I want to anatomize is how BBC Music's dealings with one specific actor, Malcolm Arnold, fashioned that cultural hierarchy. How, at the level of program planning and scheduling, did all this occur? Sorry, technical hitch, sorry, pay no attention. Part one, naming of parts, mapping the establishment. Few accounts of mid-century Britain neglect the 1939-45 war. The horror of the Blitz was familiar to all civilians. Amid common sacrifice, a national solidarity was forged. Social changes promised during the war were enacted by Attlee's 1945 Labour government. A national health service, free secondary education to the age of 15. 1946 saw an arts council chartered and the launch of BBC Radio's literary musical third programme. To many, the social and cultural change after 1945 far outflanked that had followed the Great War a generation earlier. The 1930s had cast British intellectuals as estranged critics of their society. Post-1945, there was a different sense that the war effort had involved writers, scholars, and scientists. As Stefan Collini notes, quote, "Standing alone, Britain resisted where others crumbled. Such national self-definition had been denied the French. Vichy had discredited all but Résistants and the Communist Party." Hollywood cliche apart, it's hard to dismiss the near universal experience of Britons who survived the war, and to take that experience as an influence on the later rebuilding. The BBC's new third program, a highbrow radio channel, expanded the commitment to uplift. But the post-war arts policy was far from clear. During the war, a vast new audience for the arts seemed to present itself at crowded National Gallery recitals, for example. But the crowds stayed away in the piece. The Arts Council, as Robert Hewison argues, fell back on older definitions of culture. Despite a new acceptance of performing arts as a national responsibility, alongside galleries and museums, there was confusion of purpose. Wartime debates over opera or concert parties for the troops persisted in the new system of arm's length subsidy. Advisory panels for music, art, and drama were divided between support for amateurs and professional art making, between pleasing audiences or curating innovative practitioners. The underlying tension was much older, between culture viewed as an organic collective force welling up from below, or the countervailing notion after Matthew, not Malcolm Arnold, of a search for perfection and a wider pedagogical display of the best which has been thought and said in the world. T.S. Eliot in 1948 argued that elites, not welfare state planners, should distill the best. F.R. Leavis, too, promulgated a literate tradition countering industrialized mass media. The 1951 Festival of Britain, with comforting myths of lion and unicorn, alongside atomic age architecture, struck an uneasy simultaneity between pastoral and modern. But by the 1950s, the Arts Council was favoring large metropolitan grants over individual projects. Tensions between art and entertainment, high and low, regional and national, neo-romantic and modernist, animated discussions in post-war Britain. But the debate can also be framed in sociological institutional terms. In the arm's length subsidy mechanism at the Arts Council or at BBC Music, state patronage was planned and administered by bureaucrats. Nominally independent bodies were, as Raymond Williams later remarked, peopled by a compact and organic ruling class. Noel Annan, writing in 1955, spoke of a British intellectual aristocracy, an administrative class of intermarried luminaries. It's strangely disconcerting to hold in mind simultaneously Annan's rather smug historicization of deference and the subdued ennui of Hoggart's movement poet-teacher. The first welcomed a role in a top-down cultural operation. Hoggart, having moved upwards, held nostalgia for roots lower in the hierarchy. But he too, like Eliot, Leavis, or Adorno, feared the leveling down threat of a culture industry. Clement Greenberg and Dwight MacDonald feared something worse, the middle brow, famously mapped by Russell Lynes. By the 50s, to many Britons, the new bureaucratic culture was marked as American. A modern class formation between bourgeois and proletariat, what Barbara and John Ehrenreich termed the professional managerial class, comprised salaried mental workers and arose between 1860 and 1930. By the late 50s, The PMC, in the form of advisors, think tanks, social planners, was entering a golden age. Prominent on the list of managerial professions were broadcasters. In seeking a musical instantiation of a managed British culture, a system of sorts at a national level, we confront the sprawling institutional form of the BBC. Part 2, paternalism or populism, BBC broadcasting culture after 1945. By the 50s, on the eve of independent television, the BBC's reputation for paternalism is sometimes exaggerated. To complain of its highbrow biases and a lack of regional announcers' voices, after all, is to ignore the launching in 1951 of The Archers, a radio soap opera of rural folk soon devoured by 10% of the adult population. Home and light services offered listeners all-day entertainment and dance music. For the recherche recitals and foreign operas, you went to the evening's only third program, heard by less than 1% of the audience. The BBC's post-war division into 3 channels, though, was a more intense stratification of the cultural field, high to low, than earlier in the history of its radio broadcasting. Musicologists, like scholars of literary modernism, confront, in Todd Avery's phrase, radio's alteration of the material context of cultural transmission. John Reith, the BBC's first Director General, had until 1937 pursued a post-Victorian cultural program, committed to radio as a magical mass communications technology. He sought to, quote, diffuse cultural touchstones to the largest audience in history. Where Matthew Arnold had framed culture as a social political force, John Reith, in his view, reinstated traditional religion. Relations between intellectuals and the novel medium varied. Both Brecht and E.M. Forster feared radio's almost occult powers of intrusion, persuasion, or homogenization. But modernists, from the Woolfs to Samuel Beckett, embraced the new channel. Radio, as Deborah Ray Cohen observes, transformed readers into audiences. By 1954, as Josh Epstein has shown, Dylan Thomas's radiophonic play, Under Milk Wood, could ironize the BBC's obsessively scheduled control of temporality and listener attention. The fact of the new broadcasting medium frames our debate about cultural hierarchy in British music after 1945. To understand how the BBC treated particular musical styles, genres, or composers, we note not the novelty of radio, but its blanketing ubiquity. The wartime surge of interest in the arts, as Alison Garnham has written, did fuel a post-war idealism and the consciously educative tone of the third program, and the BBC's renovation of the Henry Wood Promenade concert series. Culture was to be expanded and democratized in the post-war. The underlying philosophy, however, was riven with conceptual contradictions. Debates over music education reproduced a slippage between participation, class singing, for example, and the interwar appreciation movement. As Kate Guthrie has written, art music was both promoted to a mass audience and shielded, quote, against a denigrating association with mass culture. The BBC remained committed to a philosophy of cultural uplift. As William Haley, architect of the third program, explained in 1944, quote, we do not intend that the 3 programs shall be rigidly stratified. Rather, we hope they'll shade into each other. The classical music in the light program will, we hope, be attractive enough to lead listeners on to the home service the home should lead on to the third. Haley's optimism was misplaced. The three-tiered system did not guarantee or did not garner much of a new audience for highbrow music. Even so, the interest in curating and possibly refining public taste was real. In what follows, I explore the BBC's commitment to cultural hierarchy by means of a case study. To see how the system functioned within the music department, we pursue its dealings with one musician, the composer Malcolm Arnold, born in 1921. Arnold came of age just as the war ended, and so he was among a new generation of composers seeking to launch his career with the active support of the national broadcaster. Part 3, trite, commonplace, not highly satisfactory, Malcolm Arnold and the BBC. Arnold first sent scores to the BBC in 1945, aged 23. Already a celebrated orchestral trumpeter, he was still unknown as a composer. Within 5 years, though, a flood of new works, large and small, established him as a major talent. By the mid-50s, he was a national figure, courted for commissions and regularly played on the radio and television. Traces of Arnold's rise to fame and courtesy of his Hollywood work, his fortune, survive in the BBC's archives. The sheaves of dog-eared letters, memos, and scribbles, presumably interspersed with phone calls and face-to-face meetings, document the highly bureaucratized, formalized, and mediated process by which a composer might eventually secure broadcast. Here then is cultural hierarchy on a daily and personal level. Who got played and paid? Who got rejected and on whose authority? Arnold's publisher approached the BBC in April 1945, I don't know if we had that. Yes, this slide, we actually have the full document in front of us. The BBC clerk, Val Drury's request for praise or condemnation of the score reading panel examining Arnold's score. And then we have Arnold's joke about Mr. Drury, or is it Brewery, in his follow-up letter. And an early quintet, his Opus 7, was accepted for broadcast based on a unanimous yes verdict by the 3-member panel. Their brief reports subsequently circulated to music department program makers. Gordon Jacob, for example, praises, quote, "an amusing little work. I, for one, would like to hear it." The conductor Moscow Kana, too, finds humor. But he also sees defects. Its musical idiom suffers from lack of sustained writing. Herbert Howells, and you can see this on this memo, 10 days later, concurs, enthusiastic about Arnold's precocious talent. Quote, "The sense of effect is so keen and the touch so sure. A young man's work written with an older man's skill." The same panelists, a few months later, recommend the overture Becker's The Dandyprat. Passing a third work in 1947, Howells and Kana reiterate some familiar points. But a new panelist, Lennox Barclay, is not convinced. Quote, "There isn't much thought behind the music. One movement is almost embarrassingly exuberant, though," he concedes, "well constructed." Samplings of the panel verdict set the tone for the multiple reports that survive on each of 29 distinct titles screened formally by the BBC as far as Arnold's Second Symphony in 1953. By that date, finally, should have shown you that. By that date, finally, the composer was declared panel free, presumably by the new controller of music, Richard Hoggart. The panel descriptions of Arnold's music are strikingly consistent, and in this consistency, one catches the aesthetic stylistic tropes of the day. The reviewers identify joyous wit, fun, high spirits. They often praise skillful orchestration, and some sense excellent technique. Other impressions seem more quirky. The Horn Concerto No. 1 is virile or young mannish. Most reports fault Arnold for lack of thought, short-windedness, or commonplace material. Leonard Isaacs, a career broadcaster, like the outside advisors, thought of Arnold's Trio Opus 6 that it was far too clever to be good music. Benjamin Frankel's remark echoes the sentiment. As always with this composer, there's a confusion between wit and cocking a snook. The piece he was reviewing, Three Shanties for Wind Quintet of 1943, plays on the listener's familiarity with a familiar tune. Arnold's shanties are an early piece for chamber forces, but criticisms of more ambitious later scores take the same line. The Symphony No. 1 was unanimously passed by the panel in 1950, but even while clearing it for possible broadcast, the writers, now Edmund Rubberer, William Alwyn, and Frankel again, take aim at style and technique. Quote, "The piece has all Arnold's well-known shortcomings," Frankel grumbles. "Triviality of the material, impertinences aimed at the audience, and the lack of true symphonic thinking. But," he admits, he likes the impulse and excitement. His colleagues are similarly conflicted, disappointed at a lack of sustained thought, but falling for its immense verve and high spirits. These blunt BBC verdicts by the blind review panel echo more tactfully phrased public press notices. Invariably, the critics query the music's tone. Arnold's ideas somehow are heard to cross a line in vulgarity and taste. The related charge, lack of substance, feeds into a judgment couched in more technical, genre-specific convention that we've heard already, that Arnold's titled symphonies lack the requisite gravitas. The sound world, it seems, was not necessarily the problem. Few critics object to Arnold's forthright tonal idiom or the clean neoclassical rhythmic and thematic lines. The Symphony for Strings, 1948, and a first string quartet, meanwhile, were noted for, quote, experimental interest in modern tendencies, of interest to the Society for the Promotion of New Music, perhaps, in London. But at the BBC, circa 1950s, still not a good thing. The audience reactions, though, were rapturous. Arnold's skill as an entertainer, his music's instant appeal, its lack of difficulty, was further evidence for the critics of this taste problem. Let's hear the opening of Arnold's 1948 concert overture, The Smoke. You won't fail to catch a raunchy big band gleam, Latin jazz bursts mingled with gauzy harp touches, a rambunctious tuba, ominous brass calls. Arnold adopts a contemporary colloquial accent, and this is just the sort of piece the BBC panel was likely to reject. Sorry. The panel's approval was essential, but advisory only. A pass did not guarantee future BBC broadcasts. Radio Times listenings show that only in 1948 did Arnold secure a national broadcast on the home service. Even here, playing the comedy overture Beckus the Dandiprat, the BBC was not investing in-house resources. They simply played a new LP by the London Philharmonic under Edward Van Beenham. As documents of a wider cultural historical process, one seeks in the panel reports specific definitions of genre and specifications of aesthetic criteria. The hierarchy and the values, though, were not necessarily explicitly inscribed. Even so, we may detect the workings of this hierarchy quite clearly when writers cite BBC channel options. So in his admiring 1947 report on that clever trio, for example, Howells suggests the piece would work, quote, in the right program with the right approach in the audience. A pencil note on the Symphony for Strings reads, not for proms 1948, presumably because its style or unfamiliarity would tax a broad audience. By 1952, Arnold's Second Symphony, whose finale you heard earlier, was broadcast on the Light program. The BBC's post-war pyramid, Light, Home, Third, was clear, an institutional framework, a taste hierarchy, a grid for basic programming decisions. Even at this early reading stage, advisors and BBC insiders pondered where a piece might fit, who would hear it. Archers loving millions on the home, or a highbrow audience fraction on the third. Or it could be referred to regional rather than national services. Panel members, composers mostly, as well as conductors, by inclination and administrative charge, perpetuated a set of values, notably the aesthetic autonomy of serious art music. The memos identify gatekeepers. But Arnold was also in a small group of composers who might qualify for both the Light and Third listeners. Did the professional managerial types see him as an exemplar of cultural mobility? Catch Beckus on the Light and you'll graduate to a sonata on the Third? Or, as seems more likely, did they regard Arnold's commercial success as suspect? Modernists were not supposed to be tonal. New music was supposed to be difficult, not humorous. Arnold himself, the born rebel, defied the categories. He was happy to write symphonies or ballets 1 minute, Hollywood or Ealing studio scores the next. To make matters even worse, individual pieces often displayed his delight in stylistic contradiction. The charge of vulgarity often reflected an underlying critique of a musical discourse reveling in stark juxtapositions and rapid-fire changes of direction. Part 4. Yes, no, and perhaps. Composers navigate the BBC bureaucracy, 1945 to 51. By 1953, Richard Howgall, director of music, head of music, was reassuring composers publicly in a letter to Musical Opinion that the panel's role was advisory only. But to progressive composers such as Elizabeth Lutyens or Dennis Ap Iver, the BBC's claim rang hollow. Also, for composers of light music, they were similarly vexed by the BBC's policies of the 50s as their lucrative arrangers market rapidly lost ground to new pop artist recordings. Throughout the 50s, the polarity between avant-garde and pop positions seems to widen. It's the obvious context for examining Arnold's experience with the BBC. A second archival paper trail, the BBC's contributors files, documents the intricate three-way relation between composers, performers, and BBC Radio insiders. A composer, conductor, player, or publisher might approach the BBC. A score would be read, reports would circulate to producers, program makers. Many different influential voices might weigh in during the myriad stages from initial idea to an actual broadcast. The vastly differing tastes of, say, Humphrey Searle, Robert Simpson, Hans Keller, or Leonard Isaacs all come into play. The allegedly avant-gardist bias of William Glock after 1959 was often judged a shift from Howgill's mid-century regime as controller. But a great man view of the BBC may give short shrift to its rhizomatic and constantly rearranging bureaucracy, to say nothing of the outside pressure of regular government reviews. Arnold, back in 1947, had already enlisted several advocates launching his career. The LPO's manager, Thomas Russell, wrote the BBC in March 47, suggesting Beckers for the proms. In April, the horn player Charles Gregory, having premiered that virile Concerto No. 1, wrote suggesting it for broadcast. The publisher, Alfred Langnick, followed with the score and press clippings. The BBC responded with immediate interest, requesting other titles be delivered. There were no PDFs or photocopies, of course, so the physical scores are couriered back and forth, sometimes between conductor and concert. Arnold's professionalism and profligacy shines through, and he played the game and axis with skill. By fulfilling a commission, for example, for a piano duet concerto from Moscow Karna, to be played by Karna's wife, Helen Pike, with Paul Hamburger. For the BBC, this was in 1951, a panel, yes, was still required, but Karna's music department contacts led quickly to a third program broadcast and a later prom revival in 53. Also clear from the file is Arnold's personal persistence, as with The Smoke, for example, what we heard, the piece we heard, which was previously rejected. Arnold, undaunted, invited the BBC to hear Adrian Bolt's upcoming Festival Hall show. He talks the piece up. It's played a lot. It always seems to get a good reception. Herbert Murrell, the head of music, cordially replies, promising department members will attend. But the panel had hated the score, and The Smoke was not broadcast for decades. My final instance today concerns the BBC's rejection of Arnold's First Symphony in 1950 to 51, which, despite upbeat panel reports, was strikingly trenchant. Here, I think, the influence of BBC insiders is especially clear. As a senior administrative assistant, Leonard Isaacs asserts his power to override the panel's advice. 3 yes votes, quotes, seems to add up to a recommendation, but the material is very sketchy. Perhaps he will attend the premiere, though he's not enamored of the score. An assistant, Peter Crossley Holland, was dispatched to the Cheltenham Festival to hear Arnold conduct the piece. Sorry. And report back. His typewritten verdict, we can see that on the slide, to the AHM, it says assistant head of music, but it's Murrell, who's the head by this point, displays attitudes to Arnold familiar from press notices, though the internal memos judgment are much harsher. The piece is not true symphonic writing. The material is tawdry, sectional, and bitty. Rude percussive interruptions constrict phrase growth. At last reaching its big tune, the result turns out to be blatant and vulgar. Arnold's humor is too sardonic, again, vulgar and whimsical. Crossley Holland pronounces damningly, quote, "This is not the product of an adult musical mind." The lasting impression is ungracious and gawky. The memo circulates, and someone, maybe Murrell's hand, adds only, "I agree with this." It's doubtful younger staff like Simpson, CC'd here, could have swayed Isaacs or his boss Morrill. Arnold's Symphony for Strings had achieved a 1948 third broadcast, but to the more substantial Symphony No. 1 for full orchestra 3 years later, the corporation said no. Arnold's delight in sudden juxtapositions is a leitmotif of the critical discussions of his music. The pianist critic Paul Hamburger's published music review notice of Symphony No. 1 speaks perceptively of an elision technique. Quote, Arnold hates beating about the bush and lays himself open to inspection by all and sundry. Critics withhold their unasked for sympathies, but Arnold's style is not fashioned to disarm by frankness. It is just frank. He could easily have cluttered up his first movement with conventional bridge passages. Instead, purely musical logic for once has not been sidetracked by novelistic, ballet, or moralist aspirations. End quote. You've already heard this frankness, I think, but Hamburger might also have spoken of the music's underlying thematic tautness and Arnold's ability to radically recast the lighting of a familiar shape. Here's Arnold's folk song-like second theme, all soft bucolic chantings, and then its radically transformed return close to the end as a grand string line, the original woodwind chords vastly accelerated in a rousing brass ostinato machine. Breathless with archive fever, I've taken time to trace the detail of a bureaucratic pattern, so I forego today any grand conclusions. It's work in progress. The post-war cultural reshuffle I sketched earlier accentuated divisions between an art consecrated to intellectuals, to recall Bourdieu's description of the avant-garde position in the cultural field, and entertainment, marketed to bourgeois or even more popular audiences. Arnold's music, I'd say, puts pressure on the very idea of such a taxonomy. And the thing is, today, we're in a different place, a place where access to content is limited by bandwidth, not schooling. Was Hoggart, after all, was Hoggart right? Could culture achieve classlessness? I'd welcome comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks